Our next section, we get into our biological perspectives, and this is kind of a weird mishmash of different ideas. So it's called the biological perspectives, but sometimes you'll also see it called trait perspectives, specifically because people are trying to break things down into categories. We're calling it biological perspectives because we end up tying it back to things like our physiology or our genetics, which link to biology. But for our biological foundations of personality traits, as per usual that we would expect talking about the biological perspective, we have that whole nature versus nurture debate, and we've already established that in those questions, it's almost always going to be a combination of both nature and nurture. So nature being our genes, our underlying inborn stuff, and then nurture being the environment that we're raised in. And so we're going to want to consider both of those. And here we have a focus on things like our nervous system, our genes, and the evolutionary process that would have allowed these different systems to end up occurring. And that's why we call it biological for our perspective here. We won't go too much into the bio, though. I have sort of held myself back with the slides. But one of the biggest concepts that's going to be driving a lot of these different traits that we start looking at is something called factor analysis. Factor analysis is that statistical approach. So it's where we're taking a whole bunch of measured variables and we're trying to find correlations between them. The idea being that if we don't understand what personality is made of, what aspects are driving personality, then when we're measuring things like how do we respond to this question or how do we act in that scenario, we can end up measuring tons of different things that may or may not be getting at the same concept of personality. So we're basically saying that if we don't know, we're going to measure everything and then use statistics to boil it down. And what we want to do is get as refined of a concept, as refined of a factor as we possibly can, in order to sort of link that particular factor to a particular aspect of our behavior or aspect of our personality and how that affects our behavior. So yeah, we're going to analyze all of these different measured variables to try and identify closely related clusters of behavior. And each of those clusters, we can call it a factor, and it reflects one of our basic dimensions of some particular behavior or trait. And the easiest example of this is the introversion versus extroversion factor or cluster. So that's one dimension of personality that actually ends up being consistent across pretty much every single trait theory, which is why we use it as our example here. But if we look at things like, okay, how likely is somebody to want to go and interact with others, seek out new experiences, be outgoing, be social, enjoy parties, dislike solitary activities, stuff like that. And we can have a continuum of that. And we can have a whole bunch of different measures that would all give us an approximation of where we would fall on this particular scale. Okay, so that's a refresher of factor analysis, which brings us to one of the biggest of our types of trait theories. And this is our 5-factor model of personality, or the big 5 of personality. And this is the one that has been studied most often. So if you look at the research on personality, pretty much everything is all about the big 5. There are other theories that we're going to look at and different ways of breaking it down, and even those ones with different ways of breaking it down overlap very strongly with this. So basically, when we look at the 5-factor model and then Eysenck's theory with 3 factors, or Cattell's 16-factor model, those are all basically having different thresholds of where we're cutting off our clusters for a factor analysis. That's really the only difference between the 3 different theories. So this one is the one that is popular because, probably because it's been studied the most, and so people know the most about it, and therefore it's easier to do more research on it, because of what we already understand. So we're starting off with the standard here. But yeah, so this was determined through factor analysis, as the others are as well. And we're basically saying that the variations of all of those different factors that we identify, these 5 particular factors, end up creating the diversity that we see with our personalities. And so the 5 factors being neuroticism, extroversion, openness to experience, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And I always use this particular figure because it lists examples. So if we have neuroticism, so that's going to be a spectrum, a continuum, where we have neuroticism or negative emotionality versus somebody who's a little bit more stable and less anxious on the other end of the spectrum. And so someone who scores high in neuroticism is going to be more worried versus someone who scores low in it would be calm. Insecure versus secure, self-pitying versus self-satisfied. Then with the extroversion, this one's pretty easy to do. It's summarized as positive emotionality, but it's basically sociable versus retiring, fun-loving versus sober, outgoing versus inward-driven, affectionate versus more reserved. Openness to experience, it's another one that's named appropriately. So are you imaginative versus down to earth? Are you going to have a preference for variety or a preference for consistency? Are you more independent or conforming? That would be in that category. Agreeableness is looking at, are you soft-hearted versus ruthless, trusting versus suspicious, helpful versus uncooperative. And then the last one, conscientiousness, is basically saying, are you well-organized or disorganized? Are you careful or careless, self-disciplined or weak-willed, easily influenced by others? And these are all we have 5 different spectrums that we have to fall upon. And so each individual can score anywhere from one extreme to the other for all 5 of these different measures. And that complexity, that variability that we get, that's going to help explain why everybody is unique in their personality, because there's effectively an infinite number of combinations between all of these different measures. All right, then as promised, we can look at, well, what if we break it down and have fewer dimensions to consider? So Eysenck's theory, Eysenck was actually a German-born psychologist who ended up relocating to Britain because of World War I. So he ended up being a very famous British psychologist in the end after that relocation. And he wanted to use, again, factor analysis, break everything down. And he said that personality is structured from a hierarchy of different individual traits. And he said that there are only, honestly, to begin with, he said that there were only 2 higher order trait continua, meaning those spectrums. A third was added more recently, so psychoticism at the bottom, that psychoticism versus self-control is a recent addition to this model. It came about much, much later. When he had originally proposed it, we actually just had what's in the circle there, the introverted versus extroverted and stable versus unstable, or neuroticism versus stability. So up front, it was 2 spectra. Now it's 3, which is a lot harder to represent on a 2-dimensional surface, so we just leave that one out. But if you could imagine a z-axis, that's what that one would be. And so he says that we have these 3 higher order trait continua, so again, our spectrum. And then from that, that's going to lead us down into basic traits that are affected by each of those higher order traits. So starting with those higher order traits, the extroversion versus introversion. So that's looking at, are you sociable, assertive, lively, or the opposite? For neuroticism, once again, anxious, tense, moody, low self-esteem, or the opposite. And then for psychoticism, that's, are you egocentric, impulsive, cold, and antisocial, or the opposite. So same basic principle, but now 3 instead of 5. And there's some overlap here where once again we have introversion versus extroversion, which ends up being measured fairly similarly. But the other 2 get a little bit different. And yeah, so that's going to lead us into our basic traits, which I'm going to do some swapping back and forth between here. This is an example of one of our higher order traits, the extroversion, being broken down into those sort of second order traits or next order traits. Are you sociable, lively, active, assertive, or sensation seeking? And that gets broken down into these habitual responses that we tend to make. So we have certain traits that make us likely to behave in a particular way when we encounter certain scenarios. And then there are specific responses within all of that when we break it down even further. So this is all sort of nesting under the idea that we have certain tendencies that have come about. So how do these tendencies come about? Eysenck was very convinced that there was a strong genetic influence in place here. So he figured that genes are going to be very strongly involved in determining our personality. And he actually ended up tying this back into some of our behaviorist theories because he was talking about our conditionability, where he basically said that some people are going to be easier to condition than others, meaning that some people are more likely to learn from experience, and that sort of are you easy to condition or not could be influenced by your genes. And yeah, so some people are going to be easier to condition than others, and that would then influence which traits they acquire or don't acquire if they're not good at being conditioned through that learning process. And so this is kind of a combination of our trait theory stuff at the start, and then we're saying, okay, the traits are influenced by genetics, but then we also have learning that breaks it down into smaller components. So this is kind of an interesting way to talk about it, where we're saying that the traits that we look at, the three continua that we're measuring, that's more of giving us a baseline, a broad strokes picture of how someone might act. And then through what we've learned, through our individual experiences and how much we can learn from that, then we can see some of our specific behaviors in specific scenarios. So this would tell us that even knowing our three continua scores, we might not necessarily be very good at predicting someone's behavior in a specific scenario because there are so many other steps in between, and we would have to know about that specific situation and the previous experiences that that person has had. So we're kind of, again, mixing together a bunch of different theories, and we're, again, stressing the role of not just the person, but also the environment and what they've learned from that environment, and so on and so forth. So it's one of the reasons why this this perspective is done last, is because we actually get to pull on a bunch of the other ideas and put them all together. All right, and then as promised, we have Cattell's 16 personality factors. And so in this situation, if we were doing that factor analysis, we didn't group things as closely as we did with the other two. So by allowing more factors to exist, we're allowing them to be sort of more separate. We're looking at things that are maybe similar to one another, but not identical, and giving them each their own range. And again, we still have our spectrum of sort of high or low on a particular score. And you can see all 16 of them here. So at the top they have reserved versus outgoing. Sounds kind of introversion versus extroversion to me. Intelligence, less to more, affected by feelings or emotionally stable, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to read all 16 because you can actually see them here. And this diagram is really cool because it shows those 16 basic personality traits, but they've split it up between a group of individuals who were artists versus athletes. And so maybe there are certain traits that would predispose someone to one category versus the other. So in particular, our artists are showing as more intelligent and maybe more emotionally unstable. What else is really different? If we look in the middle here about sensitive versus tough-minded, oh, that's definitely going to be something where they differ. Where else do we have very different peaks? Forthright versus a little bit more shrewd. So an athlete might be more abrupt in how they state things and things like that. So this is just an average across a bunch of people showing that we could break it down. And so each person would get basically one of these lines showing where they score for all of these different spectrums. But yeah, this is something that's been used. One of the texts I had basically had, I think it's Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a famous serial killer, they had like all of these scores, and he ended up having very extreme scores for a lot of the spectra that would be considered bad traits. But for a lot of individuals where they're trying to understand why might they have acted in such extreme ways, they might look at something like this and see, oh, we are seeing extremes in some of these different personality traits. But yeah, I'm not going into tons of detail on this one despite that. Okay. And the next slide, we actually kind of mentioned this, but I have it all on its own, where we're saying that if we're trying to predict our behavior based on different traits from all of these different models, we've probably figured out by now that if we have a small number of factors or a small number of traits to look at, like the 5-factor Big Five theory or Eysenck's 3-trait model, we're going to be probably a lot better at the broad strokes ideas. We're going to get an overview fairly well, but we're going to be really bad at predicting a particular action in a particular scenario because we don't have that refinement. Whereas something like Cattle's 16-factor theory, where there are far more factors, we'd get a lot better of an understanding about specific scenarios, but maybe less understanding about overall big picture stuff because it's all fine details. So it's all about what you're looking for when you're choosing which of these you want to use in your research. So if you care about big picture stuff, you're probably going with the Big Five, because very rarely will people choose Eysenck's model over anything else. But we've mentioned it and that's fine. But if you want that fine-grained stuff, then the 16-factor model is equally acceptable in that scenario. All right, and then since we've hand-waved the fact that yes, we've acknowledged there could be a genetic component, or yes, genes might be involved, there's something innate, something about our nature, now we're actually going to talk about how do we know that. So we've talked before about the concept of twin studies versus adoption studies in the past. And I actually borrowed a couple of slides from another class where I remind you that with our twins, we have two types of twins. We have the identical twins at the top, where they start from the same fused egg. And because of that, they have identical genetics. So if we look at our identical twins, their genes are all the same. But our fraternal twins, or our non-identical twins, or our dizygotic twins, if you want to go fancy, they come from two separate fertilized eggs, two separate zygotes, meaning that they only have the same amount of genes shared as normal siblings would. So only 50% of their genes are shared. So if we have this difference where identical twins are 100% genetically the same, and fraternal twins are 50% the same, if we see that our identical twins are more similar than the fraternal twins, that tells us that it's the genes that are driving that, especially if we assume that they have a shared home environment. So identical twins reared together, being more similar than fraternal twins reared together, says that a similar home environment doesn't make a difference. The amount of genes shared makes a difference. And that's actually what we end up seeing, where twin studies of these Big Five personality traits, like I said, the Big Five is the standard, our identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins for literally all 5 of the possible traits. This diagram here shows the yellow is our identical twins on the top, and we're looking at correlation scores at the bottom, or concordance rates. So how similar are they? The higher the score, the more similar they are. And so in every single one of those, the identical twins, the yellow bar, has a higher correlation than the fraternal fraternal twins, the orange bar. And in a lot of cases, the identical twins are more than twice as similar versus the fraternal twins, which they are sharing twice as many genes. So logically, that actually makes a lot of sense. So this tells us that there is absolutely a genetic component here. And this is where it gets really cool, because I've mentioned before, I absolutely love the genetic stuff and how it ties to behavior. But if we go on even further, and if we look at adoption studies, so this is when we'd have individuals, or if you're really lucky, you can do twin adoption studies. But in adoption studies, where you look at people who are raised either together or raised apart, the idea being that if you are raised apart, that you have no shared environment. And so if you are still similar, even without sharing an environment, that it's more genetic. But if you are only similar while sharing an environment, and when you don't share an environment, you are no longer similar, then that would say that there's an environmental component. With personality, there is almost no environmental component. And that seems really weird, right? Because people would have assumed that if you're raised in a particular environment, it should definitely be influencing your behavior and therefore your personality over time. But this is where it gets weird because of how we calculate this. And I've mentioned this before. When we're looking at these twin and adoption studies, we have three components we measure. One being how much is due to our genes, our shared genetics. Another that's due to our shared environment, so raised together, sharing that environment. And the last component is called the individual environment, which is their fancy way of saying an error term, where each individual will have slightly different experiences. So even if you have identical twins, well, maybe one of them plays soccer and one of them plays basketball. That would be an individual environment that is not shared. And what we find is that the non-shared environment, or the error term, is going to make up a lot of sort of what's left over. The genes make up a pretty large component, but the shared family environment plays almost no role in personality. And this has been done over and over and over again in tons of different studies. And they've done these adoption studies where they're twin crossed with adoption studies. They've done it with just adopted sibling studies. Doesn't matter. They really don't have a whole lot of explanation for the family environment. And just to give you some idea of some of the things that people might be measuring and looking for correlations in. This is a summary of one study that was done. This was actually done in the 80s, or no, the 90s, 98, not 89. So fairly outdated at this point, but they all show something fairly similar, where we had anticipated about that 0.5 correlation. And so this is looking at the similarity between identical twins. And we see that some things, like if we look at absorption, imagination, so that's something related to creativity, that's actually fairly high in terms of genetic component. Same as our stress reaction related to neuroticism, that tends to also have a very strong genetic component, which we'll actually see makes a lot of sense. Anything related to how we react to stress and how worked up we might get by a scenario, a lot of times it actually ends up tying into things like our fight or flight response, which we get to talk about a whole bunch in the next chapter. So we'll kind of hand wave that component and get to it. But we then also see things like social closeness. That ends up having a very, very small correlation. But that would be a lot more about your experiences. So did you have a close friend group? Or did you have a affectionate family? Those things would be a lot more influential than your genes in that situation. So that's how we would interpret this. And so this diagram, you don't necessarily have to know any of these particular scores. We're just showing that, yeah, that on average 0.5 shows that many things are fairly strongly genetically influenced, but there's a lot of variation here, and it depends pretty dramatically on what types of traits we're looking for. So we're keeping that in the back of our minds as we move on. All right, so no more genetics, promise. But we can talk about neuroscience, which for some people might not actually be any better. But I find it really interesting. And for psychology, of course, we're going to talk about the brain. So what kinds of evidence do we have that there might be some link between stuff that's been happening physiologically? So with our brain and activity within our brain and the neurotransmitters affecting that activity. One of the clearest ones and the ones that's most widely studied is, surprise, surprise, introversion and extroversion. And that continuum, it actually ends up linking to a bunch of really neat stuff. So the first is that with the extreme, so if we look at people who are extreme introverts, we actually tend to see that they have higher levels of activity in their brains, meaning that in a neutral situation, they tend to be overstimulated, meaning that they tend to withdraw and be introverted because it allows them to minimize the amount of stimulation that they receive, helping kind of reduce what's happening in their brains. Whereas if we go the other end of the spectrum with extreme extroverts, in a neutral situation, they are understimulated. They have lowered levels of activity in their brains overall, meaning that they tend to go out and seek to maximize their stimulation to raise that level of activity. So they would choose to go out and interact with other people because it's stimulating and it helps get their brains to that sort of optimal balance point. So we can consider this homeostasis in terms of brain activation, where we might choose to get more stimulation if we're lacking, or choose to find a less stimulating environment if we're overwhelmed. And this ends up tying to individual neurotransmitters, and if we look at patterns of firing and a whole bunch of different things. But yeah, we get this correlation in activity overall and this particular spectrum, which is very, very cool. Similarly, on a stability-instability spectrum, we actually start seeing differences in autonomic nervous system arousal. So our autonomic nervous system, as a reminder, autonomic, I always think of it for autonomic is automatic. So this is the stuff we're not in control of. So this is our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And those work in tandem to help ramp us up in times of stress and cool us down when the stress is over. So combined, it's basically our fight or flight system. It's how we maintain homeostasis. And so those who have high scores for stability would be really good at regulating this. They would have predictable, balanced autonomic nervous system activation. Whereas those who are unstable, who would score high in instability, they might, say, have really high tendencies to have their nervous system ramp up. So they might get worked up over situations and have trouble balancing it back out again. For another one, we look at novelty seeking, and we'll actually look at risk seeking in a minute too, where certain neurotransmitters, so here, novelty seeking is related to dopamine levels. And if you remember, dopamine is strongly linked with our reward pathway. So seeking out a new situation would give us that hit of dopamine, which makes us feel good. It is rewarding. So individuals who are deficient in dopamine or who produce low levels of dopamine might then seek out new situations, new environments that would make the system activate like it won't when left to your own devices. So yeah, we're starting to see that there are all of these other bits and pieces that we can look at. And so to kind of think about, actually this slide probably should have been before the previous one, that neurological perspective is us looking at all of these different physiological factors. So our hormones and our neurotransmitters. Started talking about neurotransmitters with dopamine. We'll continue. We also have brain activity. So arousal, increased activity, or inhibition, decreased activity. Usually that's influenced by the presence of those hormones and neurotransmitters. And then we can see links between those different aspects, high and low levels, with certain types of personality traits. So usually we're going to see some correlations or things like that. Other ones that have been studied, testosterone is actually a really commonly studied one. A bunch of the sex hormones tend to be studied, but testosterone gets the most attention specifically because it's so closely linked to things like aggression and dominance, which then ties intensely not only to emotion, but also to personality. So if we were thinking about emotions as maybe our short-term response to something, our personality would be our consistency in those responses over time. So we can take what we learned about this for emotion and apply it here too. But yeah, so this is the male sex hormone associated with dominance, aggression, persistence, but also sensation-seeking and risk-seeking behaviors. And as per usual, when mentioning testosterone, even though it is a male sex hormone, it is also present in females as well. So this isn't male exclusive. And in fact, if we look at, say, PMS, being super aggressive right before your menstrual cycle, some of it ties back to testosterone levels. So all of that ends up being related. But yeah, because levels of this particular hormone can correlate with some of those behaviors, and if levels are out of whack over long periods of time, it can influence personality. So yeah, that's one thing. Another here is serotonin. So just like before when I mentioned dopamine tied to novelty seeking, serotonin is usually related to thrill-seeking behaviors. So it is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, but if we have very low levels of this, people tend to be very willing to engage in thrill-seeking activities, basically trying to do things that sort of raise their heart rate, give them that adrenaline rush, but also triggers a release of serotonin. So yeah, we start ending up seeing these sort of differences in their patterns of arousal where the activities end up causing activation that isn't happening at normal levels. So yeah, this helps sort of tie at least another one of our neurotransmitters to sort of atypical behaviors or maybe risky type behaviors between this and our novelty seeking. So what else might be involved or what else has been studied? One of the big ones that's implicated in personality is our ascending reticular activating system, or ARIS. And this is going to be one of our filters in the brain. So this is basically looking at a bunch of different areas that kind of feed together. So if you remember when we were doing, actually this would be back in 104, when you looked at the different structures in the brain, specifically towards the brainstem, and we had that reticular formation, that's part of this. So a bunch of those smaller structures are basically filtering incoming information. And when they decide what does and doesn't get passed on and where it gets passed on or not to, that helps regulate the levels of arousal throughout the brain. And so the operation of this particular combination of systems is actually implicated in that introversion-extroversion spectrum yet again. We talk about this one so much because it's well studied, and it ends up showing up as something that's identified in pretty much all of our different models, which kind of makes sense. If it's so prevalent in our trait models that are based on a bunch of different statistics run on a bunch of measurements, it kind of makes sense that it would be related to something that's kind of easy to pinpoint physiologically. But yeah, so typically in this situation, introverts tend to have very high levels of cortical activity. That's that activation overall. And so this system is basically permitting that higher level of activity or passing on or not sort of filtering out the stimuli. Whereas an extrovert might have more intense filtering, which leads to that lower level of activity overall. So this is kind of explaining that first of our talks on introversion, extroversion. Okay, so towards the end of this section here, one thing to comment on here is we've been focusing a lot on these different personality traits and our different trait models in this little area. And so how stable are these traits over time? Because that's one of the things we kind of mentioned earlier on as being a bit of a concern, where especially with things like our behaviorist models, there's very little stability. We're going to change with experience. And then we had the issues where we intended for us to have these stable and predictable behaviors over time, but we found that we were really bad at predicting behavior because there's too many other things going on and we need to consider more factors. And so this won't be a surprise when we say that when we're looking at these individual traits from our trait models, we do see both stability over time, but also change depending on which trait it is. And so we're kind of getting to that point where we're integrating a bunch of the different ideas, saying that some of these traits are probably linked to things like something physiological, something that maybe doesn't change over time, something that's probably driven by something genetic. And so as our genes don't change over time, there's probably little change for these particular traits. So for example, introversion, extroversion, where you score on that spectrum tends to be consistent throughout your lifetime. So if you are an introverted kid, you are probably also going to be an introverted adult because you are doing those behaviors in order to find that optimal level of activation. Things like emotionality or reactivity in a particular situation, or even overall activity levels. Those tend to be related to some of our biological, physiological stuff, and therefore would remain fairly stable over time. Even some of our thought patterns actually remain stable over time. These are fairly difficult to change. So even though sometimes we think of things like, oh yeah, how we think about stuff should change dramatically throughout our lives with experience, broad picture stuff like being an optimist or being a pessimist, that tends to stay fairly constant. It takes a fairly major life event to switch you from one to the other. Other thought patterns tend not to be as sort of sticky, but some of them can be. So it's not that they're completely changing, everything's changing. It really is which trait are we looking at and what might be driving that particular trait. Which, yeah, I guess towards the end of it, we're saying there's a lot more going on than what we might have thought, and our broad statements that we hoped at the beginning and where we started, we're getting away from that towards the end, as per usual. Okay, so the last little bit here, I think it's the last bit of this section, and then we have one more section after. But the last little bit here is all about the evolutionary perspective. So very closely related to the biological perspective, but here we're actually trying to focus on what would be driving some of these biological things to exist. So we're trying to account for differences in personality using evolution by telling that story of natural selection in our original environment and how those different selective pressures might have created a situation where one particular trait might have been beneficial over another. Or maybe we're going to explain why a spectrum, a range of different scores for a particular trait might be beneficial, and stuff like that. So yeah, we're getting into that evolutionary storytelling time and tying it into some of the biological stuff we have mentioned. And so the logic here is that the traits that contribute to our survival, specifically survival and reproduction, because that would allow us to pass on our genes to the future generations. And if we are more successful, more of our genes make it to that future generation, and there's greater likelihood of them being passed on and becoming common throughout the whole population. But yeah, so they contribute to survival, traits that help you survive, make you more likely to survive, and therefore allow you to pass those traits on through the genes that influence those traits via your offspring. And if we want some that are easy to tell stories about, things like conscientiousness that's something that's pretty easy, because if you are conscientious, you end up being more likely to engage in health-promoting behaviors and avoid risks. So you become sort of aware of yourself and your health and the implications of certain actions, so you avoid doing things that might be a danger to your health. You're going to eat healthier because you know the outcome of not eating healthy. For things like optimism, we'll actually see in the health and stress chapter that having a positive outlook is actually strongly correlated with improved lifespan, better health overall. And so you tend to then have fewer illnesses, fewer symptoms if you do get sick, faster recovery times, a whole bunch of different things. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about like frame of mind and optimism versus pessimism. But so having some of these traits might then be very easy to tell that evolutionary tale where more of the population should have stuff that makes you this because it would help you survive longer and reproduce more. If we look at type A personalities, this is something that we've been talking about personality overall, but we've managed to avoid talking about type A personalities all the way until the end here. And this is interesting because a lot of our psychological perspectives, we don't really talk about type A personalities. And if you don't know what a type A personality is, we have type A versus type B. Type A personalities tend to be described as control freaks. They are people who are high stress, they want to get stuff done, they're going to push themselves really hard. These are people who do really well in high competition jobs. So these are doctors and lawyers, people who are sort of at the forefront of their field and pushing to do better. It can be framed as positive because it can lead to success in those fields, but it also comes with a bunch of negatives because you are then in a high stress situation all the time. We also end up seeing a little bit of a weird trade-off here, where if we have our evolutionary tale of type A personalities, we kind of see almost like a competition between the sexes, where for women with type A personality, there's a bunch of negative emotions that are associated with that. And there's also the societal pressure that comes with it. But type A personalities tend to also have increased sex drives and tend to be more aggressive in their sexual encounters, which can be beneficial from an evolutionary point of view because increased reproductive acts means more reproduction, more future passing on of genes. But it ends up being framed more negatively for women. And sometimes those negative emotions and also the extra stress can then sort of show as, well, there should be selection against that. So we have a trade-off there. And then to make it even more complicated with men, that same personality type is associated with self-confidence, which actually makes them feel more sure of themselves and less stressed. It's tied with extroversion, social assertiveness, and then that also links into that increased sexual activity. So in this case, it's beneficial for men with none of the detriments that we see for women. And in this case, you kind of have, maybe it should be passed on because it's overall net beneficial, but we then would have selective pressure against it because it's not as beneficial for women. And then you end up in a trade-off situation here. It's not as extreme as some situations of sort of sexual dimorphism, where you might have this competition between the sexes, but it kind of works out here. So we saw the stability of our traits depends on the trait and it depends on what's driving it. But we've already acknowledged that with the behaviors themselves, the things that are influenced by those traits, that's where we start seeing very little stability. And that's where we start considering the situations in which those behaviors occur. So we've mentioned before that people want to be able to predict individual behaviors, but there are a lot of factors that make it very hard for us to do that. And putting it all in one place to have that discussion, because back at the very beginning of this, we were talking about, remember how important situations might be versus just the person. And then we talked about having few traits versus many traits, and having more traits makes the predictability a little bit better. But even under the best scenarios, it's still going to be really hard to be anywhere near accurate because, one, traits interact with other traits. So it's not just we can consider this one particular continuum, it's actually a complex interaction. People are complicated, and our behavior is just as complicated. We also then run into the importance of a particular trait in a particular scenario will end up influencing consistency, whether it's a conscious act where maybe we are very, very focused on the fact that I am an introvert and proud of it. So we might be consciously choosing to perform things that match that. That might be very important, and therefore we'd be more consistent for that behavior. Or maybe it's something that's not super important, or maybe we score somewhere in the middle, and therefore we might do something that's a little higher or lower for that particular trait. And it might depend on the scenario or who we're with. So that gets complicated. And then it kind of ties us into this concept of self-monitoring, which is, are we paying attention to how we act and how consistently we act under different scenarios? So someone who is high in self-monitoring would be very attentive and very conscious of different situational cues and what the appropriate response would be given those situational cues. If you are low in self-monitoring, then maybe you're going to be more attentive to your internal beliefs. So it's not so much about the situation or the people who are watching or the expectations. It's more with how I feel and how I would react in this given instance. And yeah, when we start looking at the extremes of this, we can have very different behaviors in different situations. So if people are acutely aware of their environment, they might behave like a completely different person depending on who's watching them. And that flexibility, that attentiveness itself might also be its own trait that may or may not be consistent over time, which gets us back to the traits interact with other traits. So we get into that lovely mess of it gets complicated and it's just real hard to predict. So, finishing that biological perspective, our pros and cons here, what are our strengths? Strong emphasis on our biological factors. It actually helps understand a lot of the different personality aspects we've been talking about so far. This helped give us that underlying reason why a lot of the stuff the other theories we're talking about might be occurring. So we're getting some mechanistic stuff here, which is kind of nice. And tying in with that, the biological perspectives are fantastic for empirical evidence because we can monitor brain activity. We can look at chemical levels. We can get something that's more physiological measures and less self-reports, which was some of our problems with the earlier theories. Of course, not everybody loves that, and so we end up with some of our limitations, where it's actually really hard to link exact biological processes with particular expressions of personality. This is the reason why we focused almost exclusively on things like activity levels, introversion and extroversion, and like thrill-seeking type behaviors, and that's because they tend to map really nicely onto systems that we understand very well on our own. But for other things, it's really, really hard to point to one part of our physiology that relates to that. It's also then very difficult to make specific predictions because all of these processes are interrelated. So if we're looking at brain activity overall, that's not just from one thing. That's the combination of all of our different neurotransmitters creating patterns of increased and decreased activity, and each of those is driven by different systems, and those are all driven by different incoming signals, and yeah, it's a mess. So as much as if we can make a link, it's a nice understanding of the mechanism, but it is very rare to find that link. So, pros and cons, as per usual, it kind of depends on what it is you're trying to study and what you want to look at, but it's different, and therefore we talk about it. All right, and now the last section is, now that we have all of these different theories, all these different ideas, all these different things that we might want to consider, how the heck do we actually get some of these measures that we've been hand waving in the background? Because we've been talking about sort of our assessments and correlations between different trait scores and things like that, but we have never once mentioned how we get those scores. I guess we kind of hinted when we were talking about the ones that rely on self-report that we would therefore be using some self-report measures, but what are those? So, as you might anticipate by the end now, personality assessment can come from a bunch of different ways, and a lot of the different methods will depend on what kinds of theories you're working with. So if you're going with a biological theory, you're probably not going to be using a ton of interview data, but you would absolutely have maybe some physiological measures and maybe some behavioral assessments or something like that. Whereas if you're going with more of a psychodynamic perspective, maybe you're going to have some interview data and maybe some responses on projective tests, which we'll talk about those in a minute. So there's a whole bunch of different approaches depending, but all of these can end up being sort of put together to give us different elements of a personality. So yeah, lots of different things that we can do. And as a little bit of a reminder, because we've talked about the terms of reliability and validity before in this class, I'm fairly certain. These are important here. So just like these were really important for intelligence tests, once again, also important when it comes to personality tests. So as our refresher, reliability is looking at that consistency of our measure. So we want to have people score similarly on a personality test each time they take it because it should be consistent. So we have things like test reliability, where we would see consistency in somebody's score over time. So they would be reliable across time. We might also talk about our inter-judge reliability. So if we had multiple people conducting measures, this is especially important for things like interviews and our projective tests, where people have to interpret it. You want those interpreters to be on the same page, to be using the same standards. Otherwise, you get disagreement and inconsistency or poor reliability. For validity, that's looking at how accurate a measure is. So are we using the test properly? Is it doing what it's supposed to? So we're going to assess this with the degree to which you are actually measuring the thing you think you are measuring. Basically, if you design a test to test this part of personality, does it actually do that? If it does, it is a valid test. It's measuring the part of personality you were trying to get at. If not, it is invalid and it is measuring something else and is therefore not useful. So you want a personality test to be both reliable and valid, because then the information is going to be consistent and meaningful. So that's the goal. All right, so for the different types of assessments that we were looking at, interviews, as the name would imply, you ask a structured set of standardized questions and interpret the responses. This can be done written form, this can be done over the phone, this can be done in person. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can do this. If you have sort of a verbal interview, you might be able to make note on things other than just the responses. You can comment on their behavior. Are they fidgety? Are they speaking confidently? Are they hesitant? Are they uncertain? Those other bits of information can all be useful. So you can get that from this situation. Drawbacks. this is going to be subject to a bunch of biases. All of them will have their own biases, but here the interviewer themselves can create bias. So if you look a certain way, people might respond a certain way. So if you look official, if you're wearing a lab coat and you have a checklist and you have some kind of professional air about you, they might then respond formally or maybe try and sound more impressive to match. Whereas if you have somebody who looks like a random undergraduate that you grabbed off of the campus and stuck them in the room with a bunch of questions, then they might not take it seriously. If it's a person in authority versus somebody who they're friends with, all sorts of stuff can influence that. You can also end up with biases, so people might respond differently to men versus women and all sorts of different things. We also run into the issue where, as per usual with a self-report method where people are talking about themselves, they have to be willing to cooperate, they have to be willing to answer questions honestly, they have to actually know the answers. So their memory might influence this, where if they forget situations or they aren't aware of certain occurrences, we can run into issues there. So yeah, a bunch of different drawbacks. Behavioral assessment. So we want to look at how often they engage in certain behaviors, or when certain behaviors happen, or under what circumstances certain behaviors happen. So with these assessments, because we're watching behavior, we need some kind of coding system. We need to have a bunch of rules on, okay, what constitutes that behavior happening? So if we're doing something like we're measuring how often someone smiles, well, how much of a movement counts as a smile? And are we sure that we can tell the difference between a smile and a frown? Or a smile and talking, and all of these other things. We have all sorts of little rules and things to do. And whoever's determining if this counts or not, we want that interjudge reliability. Nowadays, it's so much nicer because you can do a lot of this using computer programs where you can set up particular parameters and it will only tell you that it's happened if you meet those parameters. So if we're looking at our birds' vocalizations and we want to know when they sing this particular song, we will have something flag only if a particular pattern appears. If a different pattern shows up, we know it's not the same and it doesn't register. Yeah, so that's important. And in this situation, it's more than just a descriptor of that behavior. We also get frequency and situation and conditions and other stuff, but we have to sort of look for that or set up some of our parameters to be ready for that. And as per usual, we run into the issue of if you don't do a good job of setting that up, you end up influencing your reliability and things like that. We could tie into some remote behavioral sampling because sometimes when you're doing a behavioral assessment, if you have somebody sitting in the room making a tick on a clipboard every time somebody does something, people are going to obviously end up adjusting their behavior. So maybe you want to use some other way of doing that so they don't know they're being watched. So maybe you use security footage because most campuses have signs up that say that video recording can be used, which means that by being present, you have sort of consented to your image being used. But you can also use other methods. So we can have things like sample the behavior at random times over long periods. One really cool way they've done this is there's apps that they can put on your phone where at a certain time, your phone's microphone will kick on and it'll sample what you're talking about. It'll record for 30 seconds and then shut off again. And so if you're part of a study, they can tell you to download this particular app, they'll set you up, and it'll turn on at certain times. And therefore, you won't be monitoring your behavior all the time because it's exhausting, and eventually you'll settle into your normal behaviors. So now we don't have those adjustments from when you know you're being watched. We could have things like Again, video cameras that you might not be aware of or waiting for people to go back to normal. We can also use things like indirect measures. So if I wanted to know where people tend to walk on campus, but I don't want to creep people out by following them across campus, maybe I want to look at, it snows one day and I look at the footprints across campus the next morning. So people did their thing without me being present, and now I get to see their pathways. This also works for things like if you look at how worn out door handles are, you then learn which doorways are the most common for people to use, or which paths on the floor wear out first. If there's high wear and tear on the carpet, common pathways. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can measure this without actually having to influence the people directly, which gives you a more pure representation. Because with a lot of these behaviors, again, we're worried about influencing their behavior, changing their behavior, and not getting their true response. Okay. Next thing are personality scales, which are actually the thing that people probably think about first and the most. And these are when we design a series of questions that have been particularly curated to get us particular measures of personality. So these are objective measures where we have standard questions and we have a standardized scoring key. So if you Googled personality test, things like the Myers-Briggs, there's a particular set of questions and we tally up all of your responses and we interpret those results in a consistent way. The advantage is once you've designed it, it's quick and easy. You can get tons of data. Nowadays, you can send out a link and get hundreds of people to do it fairly easily. Disadvantages, we're still relying on people to self-report. Are they telling the truth? Did they get bored halfway through and start clicking at random? Are they trying to avoid looking bad and answering in a particular manner to make themselves look better? So we can actually monitor for stuff like that and look for patterns. Usually what they'll do is we'll ask the same question framed positively or negatively or in one way and then the opposite. And if you respond oppositely, then you are consistent. And if not, then you might be just clicking at random or not paying attention, and then we throw out the data. One of the other problems with these is they are a pain to design because you have to figure out what kinds of questions are we going to use. So I actually put in, there are two main ways that you can develop these. One is a rational approach, which is, it's based on the trait that you want to study. And you basically pick a bunch of questions that you think are relevant to the trait. So I want to study introversion versus extroversion. Great. What are things that I think relate to that? How often do you go to parties? How many friends do you have? How often do you seek out noisy environments? So we would pick questions based on the trait and our understanding of that trait. So an example would be the NEOPI. It's one of the standards in personality research. We don't have to know about these. But it was designed based on here's what we understand of these traits. We made up questions. Another way is the empirical approach. And here you have to have existing groups. So you have to have, say, introverts and extroverts. And then you give them a bunch of questions that are unrelated to their introversion and extroversion, and you see if there are certain questions that they tend to answer. The introverts answer this way and the extroverts answer that way. Now you have questions that you are certain have differences in responding based on this particular trait, and you've tested it with that. And the benefits here being that they don't necessarily have that, well, I know exactly why you're asking that question, because it can be stuff that's seemingly unrelated. But also, we run into the issue now where you need to have established those particular traits from some other measure first. So you might need a rational approach to begin with, or at least something that's been validated in the past. An example of this one is our Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI. And that one is used fairly commonly, and it actually has a ton of different scales. So it has 10 clinical scales, meaning questions that help us split on different traits, but also 3 validity scales to ensure that people are actually answering the things that they're supposed to answer and how they're supposed to answer, which is very, very cool. And I guess that extra amount of control is why it's one of the most commonly used scales. Next are our projective tests, and these ones are more interesting and fun, but also very rarely used. So these tie almost exclusively to our psychodynamic perspectives, the ones that we don't see a lot modernly, which is why they're very rarely used. But the basic idea is that you get presented with some kind of ambiguous stimulus and you have to make an interpretation. And your interpretation will then give our researcher or our clinician an insight into how you are thinking, how your inner world works. And so your response is considered a projection of your inner needs, your inner feelings, and how you interact with the world. So if you have a whole bunch of really dark and negative interpretations, you tell a bunch of scary stories or see a bunch of really dark images, they might interpret that you're in a poor mental state for whatever reason. And the 2 main ones are the Rorschach test, the inkblot test, where they show you the ambiguous shapes and ask you to say, hey, what is it that you see? But then we also have the thematic apperception test, which is basically they're going to show you ambiguous and usually creepy images and get you to tell a story. And so that image on the far right, is one of those. And I keep including it because I mostly choose my figures on which ones are the weirdest. But yeah, in that situation, they're going to say, well, tell a story. And if you tell stories that include these elements, then it means this about your subconscious. And so we look for different recurrent themes that are going to sort of tell us about how your mind works and therefore your personality. So who uses what? Because like I said, it's going to depend on your goals and your different theories and your different ideas. The psychodynamic perspectives, definitely the projective tests. Humanistic is going to lean towards different self-report measures, so interviews and maybe some questionnaires. Sociocognitive, those are going to get into some of our behavioral measurements plus maybe some social or some self-report measures. The biological, that ends up overlapping with a lot of the trait stuff. So we start seeing some inventories, but also some physiological measurements. And this isn't saying that these are the only ones that use any of these. This is more of this is the majority, but there's a lot of bleed over, a lot of crossover between multiples. So it's kind of neat to see that all of these can be used under different situations, again, depending on what you're studying. So we can think of the different assessments as the tools that we're using to determine different things about personality. And the theory that's behind all of that is basically our framework of what we think is happening. So the framework comes from our ideas, our theories, our previous research, and then we can use those different assessments as tools for continuing that understanding and building upon those frameworks, which is very, very neat.